Hello and welcome to the interview. My name is Molly Gambhir. With me today is a very special guest, Jason Miller, the chief spokesman for the Donald Trump 2016 presidential campaign, also a senior advisor to Trump during the 2020 re-election bid, and currently the CEO of the social media platform GETTR. Jason Miller, welcome to WION.
Good day, and thank you for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
Jason, we're talking at a time when COVID-19 continues to wreak havoc across the United States. The US, in fact, has a far higher COVID-19 death rate than other wealthy countries. How would you grade the Biden administration's handling of the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I think two things can be true at the same time here. I think that fortunately, the Omicron variant has been far less deadly and far less intrusive into our lives than many people thought at the outset, nowhere near as serious as the Delta variant or the original variant. But at the same time, Joe Biden ran on a promise to effectively end COVID. And we've seen anything but that. We have not seen our stockpiles restored. We're just now starting to get to the point where at-home testing kits are being sent out. All of the campaign promises from 2020 have not come to fruition. And I would just say, especially, I know this is an issue to India, to the Quad in general, to anyone in the Indo-Pacific theater, but there's been no efforts by the United States to hold the CCP in China accountable for launching this deadly disease all around the world. And that's one of the things where I'm most frustrated with the Biden administration for not taking stronger action in seeking some aspect of economic reparations.
How, according to you, could Joe Biden have handled things differently then?
Well, if you go back to 2020, when Joe Biden effectively stayed off of the campaign trail for much of the summer and early fall and was in his basement at his beach house in Delaware, saying that he was having strategy plans and working through how he was going to tackle COVID, I think the media in the United States should have held him accountable and said, okay, you spent months locked in your basement. Where are your plans? What is your recovery plan to, number one, make sure we're self-sufficient with regard to PPE, to make sure that we have all the testing kits that are manufactured and sent out to people? Why did it take so long to put this together? And so I think ultimately there was a big amount of promises that were made by Joe Biden in 2020 that he did not implement in 2021. And we're just starting to see some of them come to life in 2022. But unfortunately, by the time it seems to me that we get our handle on Omicron, we're going to have another variant coming. And I don't think Biden has shown the adeptness to be able to manage it.
What do you make of the rhetoric that we've seen coming in from Joe Biden on the Ukraine crisis and the stance that the US has taken on the conflict?
Well, I think we're in a little bit of a stuck in a middle ground here, where Joe Biden does not exhibit the confidence or the strength to ward off Putin's aggression. It's very clear also, too, I believe that Putin, much of his play here, much of his strategy is to rally his domestic base. Do I think ultimately Putin will go and try to take over all of Ukraine? No. Do I think that he wants to try to slow NATO or even EU expansion and also maybe score a little bit of a domestic political victory when at home? Absolutely. But the problem is that, again, with Joe Biden exhibiting such weakness on the global stage and also having a lack of real international dialogue with Putin, it's allowed Putin to essentially be emboldened. And I would also say, just to somewhat reflect on my previous answer, I'd also say at this time when it's going on, the major threat, the real concern that I have in the global geopolitical space is I think it's a matter of when, not if, China takes over Taiwan. And I think that's something that's going to be a massive shockwave for the entire Indo-Pacific theater. But President Xi is watching Joe Biden's weakness in dealing with Putin, and I think is probably himself emboldened to make that move against the island nation.
Right. Since you mentioned China, there is a view that Biden's China policy is looking a lot like Donald Trump's. Do you agree?
I would not agree from the aspect that just because some of the trade sanctions are left in place, that does not mean that additional action is being taken. I think that especially as we take a look at the Olympics, I think that that should have been something that the United States boycotted. I think to go to Beijing, to subject our athletes, quite frankly, to the spying, to the censorship, to even some of the testing methods, which have, quite frankly, I'm not allowed to say on a family-friendly television network, are pretty disturbing. But also, this would have been an opportunity for the United States and Joe Biden to say we're concerned with what's happening to the Uyghurs, we're concerned with what's happening in Tibet, we're concerned, obviously, what's happened with Hong Kong over the last couple of years. But again, that major issue, the fact that China and the CCP allowed this virus to spread all over the world, and they lied about it and covered it up without any concern of possible reparations from the United States, I think is really incomprehensible.
The U.S. National Archives has said that some of the documents handed over by Donald Trump to the committee probing last year's Capitol Hill riots had been ripped, torn apart, and had to be taped back. Officials reportedly taped together fragments of paper that were sometimes as small as confetti. How do you react to this?
Well, I think there's now, as far as small as confetti, I can't necessarily speak to that, but I do know, having been in the Oval Office a lot, that when President Trump would finish up with, say, a memo or something that was put in front of him, and he regarded it as something that he had already been through or processed, then he'd rip it in half and once, and then throw it in the trash can. And maybe the aides went through and, for preservation's sake, decided to grab that and tape it back together. But I think that was more of a matter of habit, something that the president had done over his decades of business, as opposed to anything else. But I do find it a little bit humorous, of just the sight of government workers trying to tape a document back together, even if it's completely insignificant. I do find that a little bit humorous, but I don't think there was any intention to subvert any National Archives request. I think that was just his habit. When he's done reading something and he no longer wants to have it around, just rips it in half and throws it in the trash can.
Just for some clarity, what is the habit that we're talking about, and why do you find this humorous?
Well, just when the president, when I've seen him, when he's done reading through something that he views as a meaningless throwaway item, frequently he'll just rip it in half and throw it in the trash can. As far as he's cleared that from his plate, that he's reviewed it and it's done. Obviously, that would never happen with sensitive documents. Obviously, sensitive type documents, or if they're important documents, that they're handed to the proper people to file accordingly. So anything he would have done that with would have been just it could have been as meaningless as a newspaper article, or something that someone printed out an article form and he just, I've read it, throw it in half. But nothing, just to be very clear, nothing that would have been sensitive, or nothing that would have been of any concern if somebody had seen it, of that type of a nature, would have been ripped in half. Those would have been handed back, to the proper government workers to go and process. So it seems to me it's much ado about nothing.
So you're saying the U.S. National Archives statement is incorrect?
I'm saying that it might be a little bit out of context, and there could have been, for example, there could have been documents that may not have even been necessarily from the president. They're referring to something that would be as small as confetti, and I imagine that must have been something that a different government worker that had something unrelated to the president may have put in a shredding machine, or may have torn up. And so I can't speak necessarily to every single document that was passed along to the National Archives, but I do think you have to look at it in the proper context.
But what you're largely saying is that none of the sensitive documents, or none of the documents to do with the Capitol Hill insurrection, would have been torn apart.
Correct. At least nothing that I would have seen. Obviously, I was not with the president in the Oval Office all the time, but obviously, if there was some sort of sensitive type document, then those would have been handled back to the appropriate government worker. But it could have just simply been an article, for example, that the president had read. And so, again, I think that keep in mind that anytime these type things happen in Washington, usually there's a partisan nature. Everybody ultimately in Washington has a partisan or ideological perspective. I, for example, used to work for President Trump, so I'm going to have a somewhat pro-Trump perspective. There are people who may necessarily did not agree with or view that they worked for President Trump, and they'd have a different perspective. So it's just important to keep that in mind as the broader picture.
Sure. Donald Trump has said that he may consider pardon for the Capitol Hill rioters if he returns to office. Does that mean he is most definitely running in 2024, or is it still a maybe?
So great question on that. And I think there are a couple parts. The first, with regard to the pardons, to be clear on that, that's with regard to people who he believes were treated unfairly and did not commit any truly illegal or violent activity, anything of that nature. Of course, if somebody assaulted law enforcement, or if they created damage, or if they did something to assault or hurt another person, obviously they should be fully prosecuted to the extent of the law. And just want to be clear that we very much stand with our law enforcement and do not condone violent behavior. But there were people, for example, who were outside the Capitol who never entered, who are, I think, are being unfairly charged and unfairly being targeted. Now, with regard to 2024, even though there has not been a formal decision yet, I'm pretty confident that President Trump does run again in 2024 and setting up what would many people would say they think will be a rematch. But I don't think Joe Biden runs again in 2024. If you take a look at the polling numbers, President Trump is handily ahead of both Joe Biden, as is even, say, a Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's the likely running person if President Trump does not do it himself. And I think that when you look at the avalanche of errors and things that have happened under Joe Biden, I think the Democratic leadership comes to him and says, "I think it's time you let somebody else run." So my prediction is that it's President Trump against California Governor Gavin Newsom. That is my prediction for 2024, and you can have me back on 2024 to see if I'm right.
Right. If and when Donald Trump does run for president in 2024, what would be the main focus of his campaign?
Well, the first would be to try to restore some of the American greatness that he was able to lead us toward in his first term. I would say that President Trump is by far the most consequential and most important single-term president in United States history, not just for the fact that he left office with this support base of some 70 million people, but also the fact that the way that he transformed many of our foreign relationships, particularly the positioning toward China, and I think ultimately where we're heading toward with the decoupling. I think also how he revised a number of trade deals to be in the United States' favor. I think those are some of the key items, and also too how he pushed for a less restrictive government when it came to regulations, lower taxes, things of that nature that allowed our economy to take off. Obviously, we've seen the economy take a dip in the United States of late, and I think that's something that President Trump can help revert and get that back to a positive course. I think those would be his main items, but I do think, in all seriousness, that I know I've brought up China a couple of times, but China really is the existential threat, not just to the United States, but to all democracies, even not just in the Indo-Pacific, but all around the world. We see where they're using the debt diplomacy to whether it be African or South American or even European nations to effectively enslave them economically as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. We see the concerns with spying with Huawei, and of course the unchecked abuses inside the country with regard to the Uyghurs and the manufacturing, I think is really concerning. And that's why it's so important. I would say that I have advised President Trump that if he does run again, that he needs to make sure that our relationship with Quad allies, and in particular India, need to be much stronger than they were in his first term. I do think they improved during his first term, but I think they could be even stronger, especially as we look at this common concern with the growing communist China.
Right. The Taliban takeover of Afghanistan has had far-reaching implications for the entire region. The Biden administration's preparation for the Afghanistan withdrawal has been questioned on multiple fronts. How would you describe the Afghanistan withdrawal and the subsequent handling of the entire situation by the Biden administration?
Well, unfortunately, I describe it as something that could have been avoided, something that was a complete catastrophe. I think that's probably about the most polite way that I could describe it. And I remember discussing this with President Trump last summer and asked him exactly how would you have done it. He said, well, number one, you get your sensitive people and your out of the Americans out of the country. You get your allies, the people who have worked for you for decades, who've been there with you shoulder to shoulder in the effort to try to bring some aspect of peace and stability and to eradicate terrorism from Afghanistan. You remove them, then you get your key military equipment out, and then, and only then, you get your own troops out, the rest of your people. And it's also important to note that during that time, and this is what President Trump did, and he's mentioned this in a couple of interviews, you send a very clear signal to the Taliban that we are withdrawing our people, we are withdrawing our supplies and our troops. If you mess with us, if you shoot at us, we're going to drop a very big bomb on your head. So we're planning on exiting the country, we're leaving. but if you go and attack us, there are going to be very serious repercussions. Unfortunately, Joe Biden did it the opposite way, where he removed the troops and almost all the troops, and then he left our sensitive equipment, a lot of our people, a lot of our allies who are still trying to get out. I've heard some of the horrific stories of the European journalist, for example, who had asked the Taliban for help and leaving Afghanistan, and thank goodness that she's okay. So I think it's really been a disaster, and it's not even just the United States. You look at the UK, for example, other coalition allies who've been left behind or put in an awkward position as well. And so it's really frustrating that Joe Biden has been such a disaster on the foreign policy stage.
Social media and digital platforms have gained increasing significance thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic. For those uninitiated, tell us more about the social media platform GETTR, founded by you, and how does it stand apart from the already available platforms?
Excellent. Well, GETTR is the all-in-one free speech platform that is taking the world by storm. We're already up to over 4.5 million users around the world. We have just launched our India team. And in fact, I'll be visiting India within about the next 6 or 7 weeks or so. So I'm very excited to my first trip to India. And the difference with GETTR is that we make sure that your political free speech is protected. And I think that's why we've been able to attract people such as the Hindu ecosystem and a number of other allies that are in India who've looked for that free speech. I know Prime Minister Modi has had his own issues with Twitter and Facebook with the censorship, and saying that there can't be this aspect of Hindu pride or Indian pride, which is, I think, something where Twitter's gone entirely too far on. I mean, just the simple fact that Twitter allows the Taliban on their platform, but seeks to shut down some of the things that Prime Minister Modi says, or even completely deplatform President Trump, I think really tells you the mindset of where these big tech social media platforms are right now. But we support free speech and we oppose cancel culture. And I would say that it's a very exciting platform. 777 characters, 3-minute videos. It's a great, so I'd check it out at the Google Play Store or at the Apple Store.
And speaking of India, Donald Trump has always had a special relationship with New Delhi. What is your assessment of the potential that the US-India partnership has going forward?
Well, India very clearly needs to be our strongest international ally outside of the Western Hemisphere of any country in the world. And it's of critical positioning. It's the largest democracy in the world. I think that people of India are prideful people who very much love their respective faiths, who very much respect their country. I think the democracy story that we've seen with India has been fantastic, and it's a growing economy. And I think it's a special relationship. I think the Indian diaspora has been very beneficial to the United States. I know, for example, I grew up with many Indian American friends here in the United States. They're a vibrant addition to our community. And we think that there is that special relationship. And we want to make sure that India remains the bright beacon in Asia for that positive aspect of democracy. And that's why it's so important for the US and India to remain close.
Jason Miller, thank you very much for being here on WION World is One.
Thank you so much.